Hello Internet, it's Lintus, and today let's talk about the new Quicken themes, in particular the ones that center around Fischl. You might have seen this as Fischl Aggravate. First, we'll talk about the reactions that actually enable this theme, Quicken, Aggravate, and Spread, and then we'll talk about the theme configuration and why we chose this configuration and why it's good. And then we'll talk about the characters that can go into the character slots. And yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So let's do a quick overview on the Quicken and its sub-reactions, Aggravate and Spread. So when you apply Dendro and Electro to an enemy, it applies the Quicken status. And when you apply Electro to an enemy that has the Quicken status, it causes the Aggravate reaction, causing bonus damage. And when you apply Dendro to an enemy that has the Quicken status, it produces the Spread reaction, and it deals bonus damage, very similar to the Aggravate reaction. Now, unlike every other reaction, when you cause the reaction, it takes away the aura of the element that was already there. Both Spread and Aggravate do not take away the Quicken status at all. So what that means is you can cause as much Aggravate and Spread as you can, as long as you can maintain the Quicken status on the enemies. So some additional notes, how long exactly the Quicken status lasts has to do with aura and gauges and stuff. I won't go into it, but it usually lasts around 8 to 9 seconds. Now, while Electro and Dendro do not take away the Quicken status, other elements, if you apply other elements, they will take away the Quicken aura, such as Pyro and Hydro. Now, how the Aggravate and the Spread work in terms of where it adds to the damage formula works like this. The talent values, such as like the ratios and attack scaling and stuff like that, are here. And then Aggravate and Spread are added right beside it. And then both are multiplied by damage percent, such as elemental damage bonus cup and artifact sets and weapon passives and such. And then if you crit, you also multiply it. So effectively, both damage percent and crit multiply the Aggravate damage. So putting it all together, what is good in an Aggravate team? How do you improve? What do you look for in an Aggravate team? One is you want lots of Dendro and Electro application. The more the better. Next, you want a lot of damage percent and a lot of crit. Damage percent is from an elemental damage bonus cup, and artifact sets and some weapon passives have them. Crit is from your substat, your circlet, and again, some weapons have them. And as for other substats that you're looking for, attack and EM are also good. They're not as high priority as damage percent and crit, but they do still contribute to your damage. And lastly, since this is a reaction, leveling up your characters up to 90 is recommended. So let's talk about the team configuration. It centers around Fischl, and you want, of course, a Dendro unit in order to cause the Quicken reaction. And then you want a second Electro, and because you're doing so much Electro damage anyway, you want an Anemo unit. Now, of course, there are other teams that utilize the Quicken reaction. For example, double Electro and double Dendro. But Fischl is very good at utilizing the Quicken and Aggravate reaction because of her kit. And that's mostly due to her Ascension 4 passive, Undone Be Thy Sinful Hex. If you cause an Aggravate when Oz is on the field, this passive triggers, and since it's an Electro application with no ICD, every time this passive triggers, it will cause an additional Aggravate. So that is why we have a second Electro character in order to utilize this passive to its fullest. Fischl herself deals a decent amount of damage, and she synergizes well with a lot of Electro characters, so it works out. Now, in terms of how to build her in this team, again, we go back to damage percent and crit are very valuable, and then attack and EM are also good. So something like Stringless with an EM secondary and a damage percent passive is good, or any weapon that gives crit is also good. As for artifact sets, Thundering Fury is decent, but Fischl doesn't make full use of the cooldown reduction that the Thundering Fury has. Thunder Suitors is also a very good choice because you can have an Electro Aura coexist with the Quicken Aura as long as you have very good Electro application. The passive will have very good uptime. And the passive is damage percent, and as we've said before, damage percent is very good in Aggravate teams. And then Gilded Dreams is also very good. It gives her a lot of attack and EM, which are good. And the combination of 2-piece attack percent or EM or the Thundering Fury with its damage percent is also good. As for Tenacity, it's less desirable specifically in this team because the attack percent buff is okay, but it's not as good as damage percent. And if no one else in the team can run it, the Deepwood Memory set, if you're running someone like Tignari that has very good personal damage and you want to buff that, Fischl can be a candidate, but you have to make sure that your Deepwood Memory set has good substats because Fischl is still a good portion of your team's damage. And yeah, that's Fischl. She's the center of the team. So now let's talk about the other character slots. So let's talk about the Dendro characters. Currently, there's 3 Dendro characters, Kole, Tignari, and the Dendro Traveler, and any 3 of them can fit in this team. So let's talk about Kole. She has the lowest Dendro application among the Dendro characters that we have, but in this team, she's still viable. And she works well, even at low investment. So you don't need a particular artifact set, nor do you need to invest in her talents or her levels, although at least get her Ascension 4 for her passives. So since she doesn't really need anything, you can give her the Favonius Warbow to help the energy of the team, and then you can just have your artifacts get enough ER for her to burst off of cooldown, and then some crit in order to proc the Favonius passive. So let's move on to the Dendro Traveler. Very similar to Kole, in that Dendro Traveler doesn't need a lot of investment in order to work. You can just use them for their Dendro application. Dendro Traveler also has more consistent off-field Dendro application than Kole, but Dendro Traveler has higher ER requirements. And building him or her is very similar. You give them the Favonius Sword, or if you don't have that or it's being used by another character, you can give them the Sack Sword or any ER sword in order to help their ER requirements. And then the artifact set, you really just want enough ER for them to burst off of cooldown. If you're using a Favonius Sword, you need some crit in order to trigger the passive. Now as for Tignari, he has higher personal damage and requires some field time in order to get his full damage out. He does require more investment than the other 2. As for weapons, it's very similar to Fischl. They're both damage dealers, so Stringless is good, any crit bow is good, and as for the artifact set, Wanderer's Troop I know is very popular, but you can also just give Tignari the Deepwood's Memory set so that he can provide his own resistance shred. So yeah, that was the Dendro characters. There's only 3 of them, so yeah. So now let's talk about the Electro units and who can be the second one next to Fischl. So first we have Keqing. Finally, Keqing has a meta team and she's pretty good at it. That's because her kit has a lot of Electro application. Her elemental skill, her E, has 2 applications of Electro, and her elemental burst is multi-hitting, so it applies Electro several times. In terms of how to build her, very similar to the principle we saw with Fischl. Damage percent is good and crit is good. For Keqing specifically, the Thundering Fury set is very good. As mentioned, the elemental skill has 2 separate electro applications, so being able to cast it twice during her field time is very good. Moving on to Yae Miko. Yae Miko has a moderate amount of electro application in her kit. Her turrets don't apply very fast electro application, but her burst has no ICD. And because of her passive, Elemental Mastery is more useful because it double dips into improving her aggravate damage as well as her damage of her turrets. Now, she does require some field time, and not only that, you need a little bit of finagling in the rotations in order to maximize the uptime of her turrets. Because you want to place the turrets down early in the rotation, and then you want to burst right before they expire so that you maximize their uptime. And since she's a Catalyst user, she can use her normal attacks to apply Electro, causing more aggravates. So combining her burst, her turrets, and her normal attacks, she can apply a lot of Electro and cause a lot of aggravates. As for building her, for artifact sets, similar to Fischl, Southern Fury is okay, Thunder Shooter is good, the Gilded Dream set is also very good. Again, Elemental Mastery double dips into both the turret damage and the reaction damage for her. As for weapons, same principles apply. You're looking for damage percent and crit. The one that comes to mind is with Sith, especially with the buffs that it gives. All of them are useful to Yae. However, because of the cooldown, you will only get one of the buffs every other rotation. So the first rotation, and then the third rotation, and then the fifth rotation, etc. But if you want your Yae to be a bit more supportive, there is the Hakushin Ring, especially when you can get refinements on it. The Hakushin Ring gives damage percent, which we've mentioned is good, and it gives damage percent to both your Electro units and your Dendro units. So it's very good in Quicken and Aggravate teams. The Hakushin Ring will come up again when we talk about other Catalyst users. Now let's move on to Beidou. Beidou is an interesting choice because she is still depending on her raw multipliers in order to do most of her damage, and Aggravate is sort of a supplement to it. And since she already pairs naturally well with Fischl, she's still a good choice for the second Electro slot. So because she still relies on her natural multipliers, her build doesn't change just because she's in an Aggravate team. You still want her to be on Emblem, and you still want her to be on attack, damage percent, and crit. And of course, the typical pros and cons with Beidou still apply. She's much better on 2 to 3 targets, and she's much weaker in single target. Now, let's move on to Raiden Shogun. Raiden Shogun is actually very similar to Beidou in that they don't change their build just because they're in an Aggravate team, and they depend on their natural multipliers in order to still do most of their damage, and Aggravate is just something to supplement that damage. And again, her build doesn't change. You want her on Emblem, and what stats you have actually kind of depends because Raiden is weird like that. Anyway, let's move on to Lisa. Lisa's main features in the team are the defense shred that is very good for both the Electro characters and the Dendro characters. And she can also function at low invested, similar to what I said with Cole and Dendro Traveler. You just have to meet their ER requirement. Lisa's ER requirements are very high because it's not a very good idea to actually use her elemental skill, so she's not generating any particles for the team. Fortunately, she's Electro and it's Fischl. Fischl generates a lot of energy, and because of Electro Resonance, you get more Electro energy. Still, she requires 200 or so ER in order to have her burst up. But since outside of the ER requirement, you can have her on any set you have. For example, if you have Ternari, you can give Lisa the Deepwood Sumeru set. And since she's a Catalyst user, she can use her normal attacks to add aggravates. Her normal attacks are actually have a shared ICD with her Tap E, her Tap elemental skill. And finally, she can wield the Hakushin Ring. it also helps with her ER, and it helps her team. Now let's talk about Kuki Shinobu. Kuki Shinobu actually has very slow electro application on her elemental skill, but her burst hits several times, so it can apply electro application 3 times if she's over 50% and 5 times if she is below 50%. Now the main reason you want Kuki is that she is a healer. Even though she's not the best at applying a lot of aggravates, she's still a viable choice and she can provide heals. Now, I highly suggest you go triple EM and not go for any damage percent or crit on the cup and the circlet. That's because if you go damage percent and crit on the cup and circlet, her healing will not be very good. As for the artifact set itself, there's not like a clear-cut best. You can go Tenacity, you can go Noblesse, you can go some of the 4-star option, you can even give her the Deep Woods memory set. As for weapons, you can go Fav if you have another teammate that really wants energy, but you can also go Iron Sting. It helps with her healing and reaction damage. So that's it for the Electro units. Unfortunately, I don't think Sarah, Razor, or Dory are very good in Quicken or Aggravate teams. Maybe in the future, something will develop with Dory to make her viable. But as of right now, I don't see her being better than Cookie. And Sarah and Razor don't really apply that much Electro. So now let's talk about the Anemo characters that can be in this team. Of course, you all want your Anemo characters to have the Viridescent Venerer set, so for all of them, VV is assumed. In general, most of the Anemo characters don't need to change their typical build. Also to note that Electro Swirls can cause Aggravate and Quicken reactions, and any infusion that the Anemo character has that can infuse Electro can also cause Aggravate and Quicken. Let's start with Kazuha. Kazuha brings the typical Kazuha things. He brings damage percent, he brings the VV shred, and he brings a little bit of grouping with his elemental skill. And currently, Quicken teams don't seem to have a character that requires a lot of field time. There's Tinari and Keqing that require some field time, and Yai as well. This gives you the flexibility to potentially cast Kazuha's elemental skill twice. You lower his energy requirements, and you also cause him more swirls, so that's nice. Let's move on to Sucrose. Sucrose of course has her elemental mastery sharing from her passive, and because she's a catalyst user, her normal attacks can swirl. Now, normally Sucrose's infusion on her elemental burst is hard and inconsistent, but in this team it's much more consistent because there's only one element that can be infused, which is Electro. And if you have C6 on your Sucrose, then this adds more damage percent to your Electro characters. And since she's a Katos user, much like Yai and Lisa that I mentioned before, she can wield the Hakushin Ring. Hakushin Ring, of course, has damage percent, and it adds damage percent for both your Electro characters and your Dendro characters. Let's move on to Venti. Venti is here for one thing, and that's his amazing grouping. He does also have an energy refund for your Electro characters, which is nice on energy-hungry Electro characters like Lisa, Beidou, and maybe Yai. Although if you have Elegy, he can also provide an offensive buff to your team. Next, we have Jean and Sayu. I'm putting them together basically because they're both healers. Currently, there's no Dendro healer, and our choices for Electro healers is a bit limited, and you have to give up a bit of damage. So giving up a more offensive support like Sucrose or Kazuha for a healer Anemo is also an option. But outside of a healer role, they don't provide as much offensive utility, like I said. But if you need a healer, there you go. Then there is Heizo. Now, he provides a lot less utility than every other Anemo character we've talked about so far. He's basically there to provide his damage, his personal damage, and a little bit of swirls, although he needs to do charge attack in order to actually get a lot of swirls. He is a catalyst user, so he can have the Hakushin ring. He doesn't need the energy, but providing the damage percent for your Electro and Dendro characters is nice. But he's kind of the last choice I would have for this slot. And as a final choice for this slot, Zhongli, who is not actually an Anemo character, but he can fulfill similar roles. He's a defensive character with his very big shield that also provides resistance shred. Now, the resistance shred is all elements, so even your Dendro characters can benefit, unlike the other Anemo characters that only benefit your 2 Electro characters. But it is less than the VV shred. So he can be used in teams like, for example, if you have Denari, you have him well invested, and he's a bigger portion of your damage. And having the shield also helps Denari get his full combo without being interrupted. So I think he's a viable option for this slot, even though it's not Anemo. And there you go. That's a rundown of the different characters that can fit into the different slots of the Quicken team, or Fischl Aggravate specifically. Again, there are other team combinations that can work. For example, something that I didn't discuss was TF Kazuha Aggravate, which TF Kazuha is always fun. And there's the potential in the future, once we get more Dendro characters, that double Dendro and double Electro will be better in the future. But yeah, I'm excited to see when that happens. Thank you for watching.